May 7th, 1945. The Second World War in Europe had just ended. Germany had surrendered only a few hours earlier. Across Europe, American soldiers were celebrating. They laughed, hugged each other, and filled the streets with music and cheers. For most people, the war was finally over. But General George S. Patton was not celebrating. That day, Patton sat inside a large German mansion near Frankfurt. The building had been taken over by the American army. Sitting across from him was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces. The two men had worked together during the war, but this meeting was different. Patton had come to say something dangerous, something that would ruin their relationship, something that would soon cost him his command. Patton spoke seriously and without emotion. "We're going to have to fight them eventually," he said. "Let's do it now, while our army is strong, organized, and ready to win." He was not talking about Germany. He was talking about the Soviet Union. Eisenhower stared at him in silence. For 3 long years, Eisenhower had carefully built an alliance with the Soviets to defeat Adolf Hitler. Millions of Americans believed the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was a trusted partner. Newspapers and radio programs praised the Red Army as brave heroes who helped save Europe. Now, Patton was suggesting something shocking, attacking their former ally immediately before the Soviets could grow stronger. Eisenhower finally spoke. "George, you don't understand politics," he said calmly. "The war is over. The people want peace. We're going home." Patton listened, and in that moment he understood something deeply troubling. Eisenhower knew Patton might be right. He could see the danger, but he also knew that no one in Washington wanted to hear it. The public was tired of war. The politicians wanted calm, not conflict, and the media would destroy anyone who talked about another war so soon. So Eisenhower chose silence. That silence became one of the most important moments in American military history. Patton believed the Soviet Union would eventually become an enemy. He believed waiting would only make the future war harder and more deadly. At that moment, the Red Army was exhausted, spread thin, and recovering from massive losses. Meanwhile, American forces were at their strongest point in history. Patton believed this was the last real chance to stop the Soviets before they became too powerful. But no one wanted to listen. Within months, Patton was removed from command. His warnings were dismissed as reckless and crazy. Politicians and journalists painted him as unstable. History, however, would later show that Patton had seen the coming conflict early, long before the Cold War officially began. What followed that meeting was not action, not debate, and not preparation, but silence. And that silence helped shape the world for the next 50 years. General Patton's Third Army had pushed farther into Germany than any other Allied force. His soldiers moved fast and fought hard. His tanks rolled through city after city, crossing deep into enemy territory. Some of his units even reached Czechoslovakia, and his most advanced troops were close enough to Berlin that they could have attacked it if they had been allowed. As Patton moved forward, he noticed something that deeply disturbed him. Everywhere he went, he saw the Red Army. Soviet forces were spreading across Eastern Europe, and what they were doing shocked even American soldiers who had survived years of brutal combat. Patton's intelligence officers sent him report after report describing terrible acts. They spoke of mass rapes, organized looting, and quick executions of civilians who were suspected of opposing communism. Many innocent people were arrested without trials. Entire families and communities were forced onto trains and sent to Soviet labor camps, never knowing if they would return. In April 1945, Patton wrote a letter to his wife, Beatrice. In that letter, he did not hide his anger or fear. He wrote that he had no desire to understand the Russians as people. He only wanted to know how much force it would take to stop them. He warned that the Russians were something the world would need to fear in the future. Patton was seeing a reality that leaders in Washington refused to accept. To many American diplomats, the Soviet Union was still a wartime partner. They believed that once the fighting stopped, Joseph Stalin would keep his promises. They trusted that he would allow free elections and help build democratic governments in Eastern Europe. Patton did not believe this for a moment. His doubts grew stronger when he met American prisoners of war who had been liberated by Soviet forces. These men told disturbing stories. They said the Soviets treated them worse than the Germans had. Their watches, boots, and food were stolen. When American officers complained or demanded respect, they were beaten. Some were even shot. The reports never stopped coming. Soviet forces were tearing apart German factories, loading machines, steel, and entire production lines onto trains and sending them back to Russia. They were not rebuilding Europe, they were stripping it bare. At the same time, they were setting up communist-controlled governments in countries like Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. These governments answered not to their people, but to Moscow. Even worse, Soviet security forces were hunting down anti-communist resistance fighters. Many of these men and women had spent years risking their lives fighting the Nazis. Now, after the war was over, they were arrested, tortured, or executed by the very army that claimed to be liberating them. To Patton, the truth was clear. The Soviet Union was not just an ally of convenience. It was a totalitarian empire, expanding westward while pretending to be a partner. And Patton believed that if the United States did not act quickly, the price would be paid later by future generations. By May 1945, General George S. Patton had done more than complain or express anger. He had developed a clear and detailed military plan. This was not emotional talk from a frustrated general who hated politics. It was a serious strategy, carefully built using intelligence reports and real facts about the strengths and weaknesses of the Soviet Union. Patton's thinking was direct and practical. The Red Army had just won a brutal war against Nazi Germany, but the victory came at an enormous cost. The Soviet Union had lost around 27 million people. Entire cities were destroyed. Millions of soldiers were dead, wounded, or exhausted. Soviet forces now spread across Eastern Europe, but they were tired, stretched too far, and surviving on captured German supplies. Their supply lines were dangerously long. Food, fuel, weapons, and replacement parts had to travel thousands of miles from deep inside Russia. Many units lacked proper equipment and rest. On paper, the Red Army looked massive. In reality, it was worn down. The American situation was very different. U.S. forces were at their strongest point of the entire war. Soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, and well-rested. American supply lines were short, organized, and secure. Most importantly, the United States had complete control of the air. American bombers and fighter planes ruled the skies, while the Soviets had almost no ability to strike back from the air. Patton thought this imbalance created a rare and powerful opportunity. In May 1945, he told Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson that the United States could defeat the Soviet Union in a short time. He estimated that it could be done in 6 weeks if action was taken immediately. One major reason was Soviet weakness in the air. The Soviet Union had no strategic bombing force capable of attacking American supply centers or cities. Their anti-aircraft defenses were weak and limited. Patton believed American air power alone could destroy Soviet logistics, cutting fuel, ammunition, railroads, and communication lines, paralyzing the Red Army without needing massive ground battles. Soviet tanks worried many American planners, but Patton was not impressed. Yes, the Soviets had built a large number of tanks, but after 4 years of non-stop fighting, many were mechanically worn out and unreliable.
Breakdowns were common, spare parts were limited. American M4 Sherman tanks were not as heavily armored, but they had one huge advantage: reliability. They worked consistently, were easy to repair, and were available in overwhelming numbers. Patton believed numbers, speed, and air support mattered more than thick armor. But the most important weakness, in Patton's view, was morale. Soviet soldiers had been told they were fighting to defend their homeland against invasion. Many believed the war would end once Germany was defeated. Patton did not think they wanted to occupy foreign countries or fight another massive war so soon. He believed that if American forces pushed east, many Soviet soldiers would surrender, refuse orders, or desert. Patton also made a proposal that shocked officials in Washington. "We can arm the Germans," he said. There were hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, especially from the former Wehrmacht, who were now prisoners or recently disarmed. Patton argued that these men feared the Soviets far more than they feared the Americans. Many would rather fight the Red Army than be sent to Soviet prison camps where survival was unlikely. To Patton, this was not about forgiveness or friendship, it was about using reality as it existed. Washington was horrified. The United States had just spent 4 years fighting Nazi Germany. Millions of lives had been lost. The idea of rearming German soldiers, even for a new war, felt morally unacceptable and politically explosive. But Patton's reasoning was cold, brutal, and logical. German soldiers hated and feared the Soviets. They did not feel the same hatred toward Americans. From Patton's military point of view, a former enemy who shared the same fear could still be useful. "I would rather have a German division on my side than a Soviet one," Patton wrote. Within weeks, that comment was leaked to the press. Newspapers portrayed Patton as dangerous, reckless, and unstable. His ideas were not debated seriously, they were dismissed, and with that, his influence in Washington came to an end. But Patton believed history would prove him right, and that delaying action would only make the future far more dangerous.
General Dwight D. Eisenhower did have military reasons for rejecting Patton's plan. The war in Europe was finally over, and the American people wanted peace. Families wanted their sons and husbands to come home. Soldiers had been fighting for years, and the nation was exhausted. In Washington, Congress was already pushing for rapid demobilization, meaning the army would soon shrink, not grow. There were also serious logistical problems. American forces were organized and supplied to occupy Germany, not to launch a new invasion farther east into countries like Poland. Roads, railways, fuel supplies, and command structures were all designed for ending the war, not starting another one. But these were not the real reasons Eisenhower rejected Patton's proposal. The true reasons were political. In April 1945, Harry Truman had just become president after Franklin Roosevelt's death. Truman chose to continue Roosevelt's policy of cooperation with Joseph Stalin. The recent Allied conferences had already created a plan for how Europe would be divided and governed after the war. Attacking the Soviet Union would destroy that entire framework overnight. Eisenhower understood something very clearly. If he suggested a war against the Soviets, his career would be finished. He would be accused of warmongering, of trying to start a new global war just as the last one had ended. People would say he was betraying an ally and risking World War III. The press would turn on him immediately. Politicians in Washington would remove him from command. There was also a personal reason, though Eisenhower rarely admitted it openly. He had just become a national hero. Newspapers praised him as the greatest American military commander since Ulysses S. Grant. His face was everywhere. Some people were already talking about him as a future presidential candidate. For Eisenhower, the war had ended at the perfect moment. Why risk everything by supporting a plan that the public would hate? Eisenhower also believed strongly in diplomacy. He thought that once the war ended and emotions cooled, Stalin could be reasoned with. He believed the Soviet Union would soften its behavior over time.
He trusted that international organizations, especially the United Nations, could manage disputes and prevent future wars between powerful nations. Patton did not share this belief. This difference in thinking marked a deep divide between the two men. Eisenhower trusted institutions, negotiations, and political processes. He believed that long-term stability came from cooperation and rules. Patton, on the other hand, believed in military strength and timing. He thought power mattered more than promises. He believed that when an opportunity appeared, it had to be taken immediately, or it would be lost forever. Eisenhower thought like a future president. Patton thought like a warrior. At one point, Eisenhower explained this difference to his chief of staff. "George sees the world as a battlefield," he said. "He doesn't understand that we have to live with these people." That belief, more than any military calculation, is why Eisenhower chose peace over confrontation and why Patton's plan was quietly buried.
General Patton was not alone in his thinking about the Soviet Union. Another powerful leader had reached the same conclusion, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain. Churchill had distrusted Russian communism for most of his life. His fear did not begin during World War II. It went all the way back to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, when the communist government first took power in Russia. From that moment on, Churchill believed that Soviet communism was dangerous, aggressive, and expansionist. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Churchill had no real choice. Britain was fighting for survival. The alliance with Stalin was not based on trust or friendship, it was based on desperate necessity. Churchill famously believed that once Hitler was defeated, the alliance would not last. By April 1945, as Germany collapsed, Churchill's fears returned with urgency. He could see Soviet armies moving rapidly across Eastern Europe. He watched them take control of country after country. Alarmed, Churchill began sending urgent messages to President Harry Truman and General Eisenhower. He urged Western armies to move east as fast as possible before the Soviets could fully secure their control. Churchill wanted American and British forces to reach major European capitals first. He believed that if the West arrived before the Red Army, those countries might still have a chance at independence. Specifically, Churchill wanted the Allies to capture Berlin, Prague, and Vienna before Soviet troops entered those cities. To him, geography meant power. Whoever stood on the ground at the end of the war would decide the future of Europe. In a letter to President Truman dated May 12, 1945, Churchill wrote a warning that would soon become famous. "An iron curtain is drawn down upon their front," he said. "We do not know what is going on behind." This was the first time Churchill used the phrase "Iron Curtain," a term that would later define the entire Cold War. Churchill did not stop with words. In May 1945, he went further and proposed a shocking idea known as Operation Unthinkable. Operation Unthinkable was a serious military plan. Its goal was to launch an Allied attack against Soviet forces and push them out of Poland and Eastern Europe. Like Patton, Churchill believed time was critical. The plan assumed that rearmed German soldiers would fight alongside American and British troops against the Soviets. The idea sounded extreme, but it was not dismissed immediately. The British chiefs of staff carefully studied Operation Unthinkable. They reviewed troop numbers, supply routes, air power, and battlefield conditions. After their analysis, they reached a surprising conclusion. If the attack were launched immediately, while Soviet forces were still exhausted and before they could fully organize their defenses, the plan was militarily possible. Their estimates suggested that Allied forces, supported by German units, could defeat Soviet armies in Eastern Europe within a few months. However, military possibility was not enough. The political risks were enormous. Public opinion, war exhaustion, and fear of another global conflict made the plan unacceptable.
Like Patton's proposal, Operation Unthinkable was quietly shelved and locked away in classified files. But the message was clear. Some of the most experienced leaders of the war, men who understood power, history, and human nature, were already warning that the next great conflict was beginning, even as the last one had just ended.
However, the military planners also gave a serious warning. They said that any attack on the Soviet Union would require total commitment. It could not be half measures or limited action. If the West chose that path, it would mean another full-scale war. Winston Churchill sent the plan to President Harry Truman. Truman read it and rejected it immediately. He was deeply shocked by the idea of attacking the Soviet Union so soon after the war had ended. Even more shocking to him was the suggestion to rearm German soldiers. To Truman, this idea felt morally wrong and politically impossible. The American people had just defeated Nazi Germany. Asking them to fight alongside former German troops was unthinkable. When Patton learned that Churchill had proposed almost the same strategy, he felt relieved. For months, he had felt isolated and ignored. "At least one man in power understands what we're facing," Patton told his staff. Events soon began to prove Churchill's warnings correct. Within months, the Soviet Union tightened its control over Eastern Europe. But while these events unfolded, something else was happening back home. During the war, the American press loved Patton. They praised his bravery, his bold leadership, and his battlefield success. But in May and June of 1945, the tone suddenly changed. Patton's private comments about the Soviet Union were leaked to journalists. His idea of using German soldiers was described not as strategy, but as sympathy for Nazis. Newspaper columnists began to attack him personally. Some questioned his judgment, others questioned his mental stability. The famous journalist Drew Pearson wrote that Patton's statements about the Soviet Union raised serious concerns. He said that at a time when Americans wanted peace, Patton seemed eager to start another war. The New York Times published editorials claiming that Patton did not understand diplomacy or political reality. Time magazine suggested that his aggressive personality might be fine for war but dangerous in peacetime. None of these outlets reported what Patton was actually seeing in Eastern Europe. None investigated the reports of Soviet brutality that Patton's intelligence officers were sending back. No one followed up on the mass arrests, executions, or forced labor camps. The story had already been decided. Patton was now described as a great battlefield commander who could not adjust to peace. By August 1945, General Eisenhower was receiving strong pressure from Washington. Political leaders wanted Patton removed from command. They needed a reason that sounded official and acceptable. That reason came from the issue of denazification. At a press conference, Patton criticized the policy that required all former Nazi Party members to be removed from government and administrative jobs. He argued that many Germans had joined the party for practical reasons, not because they believed in Nazi ideology. He compared the situation to American politics, saying, "This Nazi thing is just like a Democrat and Republican election fight." The comment exploded across the media. It was reported as Patton minimizing Nazi crimes and excusing their actions. The public reaction was immediate and furious. His words were taken out of context, but the damage was done. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower officially relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. The public explanation focused on his denazification comments, but everyone inside the military understood the truth. Patton was removed because he would not stop warning about the Soviet Union. He refused to stay silent, and in the political climate of 1945, that made him too dangerous to keep in command. After being removed from command, General George S. Patton did not retire quietly. In the final months of his life, he focused on one mission: warning America about the Soviet Union. He carefully documented Soviet actions in Eastern Europe and wrote urgent letters to leaders in Washington. His words from October and November 1945 now read like dark predictions of the future. In one letter, Patton wrote that the United States must stay strong and prepared. "Let's keep our boots polished, our bayonets sharp, and present a picture of strength to the Red Army," he said. Patton believed the Soviets respected only power. To him, weakness invited aggression. He warned that if America failed to remain firm, the victory over Germany would be meaningless. "We have beaten and disarmed the Germans," he wrote, "but if we lower our guard now, we will lose the war that truly matters." In early December 1945, Patton met once more with Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson. During this meeting, Patton spoke openly and without hesitation. He predicted that the Soviet Union would never leave Eastern Europe. He said they would install communist governments and slowly push their influence westward. He warned that confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union was not a question of if, but when. "We're going to fight them eventually," Patton said. "In 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years, we will wish we had done it in 1945, when we had the chance." Patterson listened carefully and respectfully, but his response was clear. Washington did not want conflict. The American people were tired of war. They wanted their lives back. Patton's warnings, no matter how serious, were politically impossible to act on. Then, just 3 days later, tragedy struck. On December 9, 1945, near the German city of Mannheim, Patton was riding in a staff car when it was hit by a truck. The crash left him paralyzed from the neck down. Though his mind remained sharp, his body failed him. After nearly 2 weeks of suffering, George S. Patton died on December 21, 1945. He was only 60 years old. The timing of the accident immediately raised questions. Some people found it suspicious that Patton was injured only days after delivering his final warning. Conspiracy theories began to spread. Critics pointed to the truck driver's explanation and said it did not fully make sense. However, despite years of speculation, no credible evidence of assassination was ever found. Most historians agree it was likely a tragic and random accident. Still, the result was the same. The most outspoken American general warning about the Soviet threat was suddenly gone. Within months of Patton's death, his predictions began to come true. Eastern Europe fell behind the Iron Curtain. Communist governments spread. Tensions grew, and the Cold War began, exactly as Patton had warned. In the end, Patton did not live to see history prove him right. But his final message remains clear. Strength, preparedness, and honesty matter, especially when they are unpopular.
In the years that followed, almost everything General Patton predicted came true. By 1946, the Soviet Union had fully secured its control over much of Eastern Europe. Soviet forces dominated Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. These countries were no longer free to choose their own future. Although the Allies had promised free and fair elections at the wartime conferences, those promises were never kept. In Poland, the situation was especially brutal. Resistance fighters who had spent 6 years fighting the Nazis believed they would help rebuild an independent country. Instead, Soviet security forces arrested them. Many were executed. Thousands more were sent to labor camps where few survived. Poland was not liberated, it was occupied. In Czechoslovakia, events followed a similar path. After the war, the country briefly returned to democracy, but in 1948, a communist coup, backed by the Soviet Union, overthrew the elected government. Soon after, Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk was found dead beneath a window. His death was officially ruled a suicide, but many believed he had been murdered. Once again, opposition voices were silenced. The same pattern appeared again and again across Eastern Europe. First came Soviet military occupation. Then came communist-controlled governments. Then came the removal, imprisonment, or execution of anyone who resisted. From 1945 to 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe were responsible for the deaths of approximately 1 million people. Millions more were imprisoned, tortured, or forced to live under constant fear and surveillance. Entire generations grew up without political freedom. The Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill warned about did not disappear. It became permanent. The global conflict that Patton had tried to prevent, the Cold War, lasted 45 years. It consumed trillions of dollars, reshaped global politics, and killed millions of people in proxy wars fought across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. By 1949, the Soviet Union had developed atomic weapons, ending America's nuclear monopoly. By 1950, stopping communist expansion required open warfare on the Korean Peninsula. The world had entered a dangerous era defined by fear, military standoffs, and constant tension. Patton's central argument was simple. He believed that May 1945 was the one moment when action was possible. The Red Army was exhausted from years of fighting. Soviet supply lines were stretched thin. American forces, by contrast, were strong, united, and fully mobilized. Patton believed that this brief moment was the last real window of opportunity to stop Soviet expansion before it became permanent. Whether a military confrontation would have succeeded is still debated by historians. Whether it was politically possible is not. It clearly was not. But the facts remain. Every major outcome Patton warned about happened. Soviet occupation became permanent. Communist expansion continued. Military confrontation eventually became unavoidable. The only things that changed were timing and scale. Patton did not prevent the Cold War. He only failed to convince others that it was coming.
For many decades after General George S. Patton's death, history slowly proved that his warnings were not exaggerations. They were accurate. Again and again, events unfolded exactly as he had predicted. The dangers he spoke about became real. The policies he argued against led to long and painful consequences. By 1947, even many Americans who had supported President Roosevelt's policy of cooperation with the Soviet Union were forced to admit that it had failed. The idea that Stalin could be trusted no longer seemed realistic. That same year, American diplomat George Kennan sent his famous long telegram from Moscow. In it, he described Soviet behavior as aggressive, expansionist, and driven by ideology. His analysis sounded very similar to what Patton had warned about back in 1945. Soon after, the United States adopted the Truman Doctrine. This policy committed America to stopping the spread of communism wherever it appeared. But the strategy chosen was containment, not confrontation. Containment accepted that Eastern Europe was already lost. It meant allowing Soviet control there to remain permanent. This decision shaped the next half-century. Instead of one decisive moment, the United States fought limited wars, first in Korea, then later in Vietnam. Millions of lives were lost. Entire nations were destroyed. The Cold War dragged on for 45 years, filled with fear, nuclear tension, and proxy conflicts around the world. Patton believed this long struggle might have been avoided if action had been taken in 1945, when the opportunity still existed. Among conservatives, Patton became known as a prophet, a man who saw the truth early while politicians chose caution and compromise. General Douglas MacArthur, who later clashed with President Truman during the Korean War, shared similar views. MacArthur wrote that Patton understood communism could not be managed through diplomacy alone. He believed Patton's removal was a tragedy and that the cost of ignoring his warnings was still being paid. Decades later, Ronald Reagan echoed Patton's thinking.
During his 1980 presidential campaign, Reagan spoke openly about confronting the Soviet Union with strength rather than accommodation. He described it as an evil empire. His language and approach closely matched the ideas Patton had expressed decades earlier. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many conservatives argued that Reagan's policy of strength had proven Patton right at last. They believed that firm resistance, not compromise, had finally ended the Cold War. Some went even further. They argued that if Patton had been listened to in 1945, Eastern Europe might have been freed 45 years earlier. Millions of lives might have been spared decades of oppression, imprisonment, and fear. Patton had identified the Soviet threat long before most American leaders were willing to admit it existed. He had proposed a solution at the only moment when it might have worked, and he was silenced, not because he was wrong, but because his truth was uncomfortable. In the end, Patton did not shape policy, but history shaped his legacy, and history remembered that he saw the storm before the clouds were visible.
The question of whether General George S. Patton was right in 1945 is not just a matter for history books. It raises deep and important questions about American strategy that still matter today. When should the United States choose military action instead of diplomacy? When is it better to confront a growing threat early rather than wait and react later? And what role should military leaders play when they believe political leaders are making a dangerous mistake? These questions did not begin with Patton, but in 1945 they appeared in a clear and dramatic way, and they return again and again in every generation. After the September 11th attacks, Americans faced similar debates. Should the United States strike terrorist groups before they could attack again? Or should it wait and respond only after threats became real and visible? The arguments sounded very much like the disagreement between Patton and his leaders after World War II. Today, as China grows more powerful, similar questions are being asked once again. Should the United States challenge Chinese expansion now while American power is still greater? Or should it rely on diplomacy and economic pressure, hoping conflict can be avoided? Patton's warnings from 1945 still feel relevant because they represent the warrior's perspective. This view believes that threats should be confronted when they are weak and vulnerable, not managed until they become strong and dangerous. From this perspective, delay only increases the cost of future conflict. This view is always in tension with the diplomat's perspective. Diplomats believe most conflicts can be controlled, reduced, or resolved through negotiation, patience, and compromise. They worry that early military action creates unnecessary wars and long-term instability. Patton's removal from command can be understood in two very different ways. Some see it as the system working properly. A general who refused to accept civilian authority was removed, preserving democratic control of the military. Others see it as the system failing. A general who correctly identified a serious strategic threat was silenced because his message was politically inconvenient. This debate matters because future military leaders will face the same dilemma. When generals see dangers that politicians do not want to acknowledge, should they stay quiet, or should they speak openly, even if it ends their careers? Patton's answer was clear. He believed that a soldier's duty was to speak the truth, no matter the personal cost. He chose honesty over silence. He paid for that choice with his command and possibly with his life. But because he refused to remain quiet, his warnings were preserved, and when history later confirmed many of his fears, his voice was remembered. That is why the debate over Patton is not just about the past.
It is about how nations choose between comfort and courage, and whether telling uncomfortable truths is worth the price.
General Dwight D. Eisenhower's decision not to support Patton reveals a lot about how he thought about leadership. Eisenhower was a man who excelled at building coalitions. During World War II, his greatest skill was keeping the Allied powers together: Britain, the United States, and even the Soviet Union. He knew how to balance competing interests, manage personalities, and make difficult compromises. This was his genius. But this same strength became a limitation when it came to Patton's plan. Patton was saying something very uncomfortable. The coalition Eisenhower had spent years building was already in danger, because one member, the Soviet Union, was not truly an ally, but a potential enemy. Patton argued that the United States should act immediately while it had the strength to confront the Soviets. Eisenhower could not accept this idea. To do so would mean throwing away the coalition he had built. It would mean admitting that his careful alliances were, in Patton's words, worthless against the real danger. For a man whose life and career were built on holding people together, that was psychologically very difficult. There was another factor. Eisenhower liked being liked. He enjoyed the respect of his colleagues, the admiration of the public, and the praise of world leaders. Supporting Patton's plan would have made him the public face of a new conflict with the Soviet Union. It would have destroyed his reputation as a peacemaker and a uniter of nations. By 1945, newspapers and politicians were already discussing Eisenhower as a possible presidential candidate. Any move to attack the Soviets would have been political suicide. The mood in America also played a role. The nation was exhausted from years of war. Soldiers were returning home, families wanted peace, and the public was eager to forget conflict. Launching another war, even against a potential future enemy, would have been extremely unpopular. The media, which had supported Eisenhower as a hero, would have turned against him. They could have accused him of starting a second world war only months after the first one ended. So, Eisenhower chose what was politically safe. He rejected Patton's warnings. When Patton refused to stay silent, Eisenhower removed him from command. Then he continued to pursue cooperation with Stalin, following the diplomatic path rather than the military one. From a political perspective, Eisenhower's decision made sense. It was cautious, safe, and understandable. But from a strategic perspective, it was disastrous. Patton had seen the Soviet threat clearly. Eisenhower ignored it because he was focused on politics, reputation, and immediate alliances rather than long-term consequences. Later in life, Eisenhower expressed some regret about not taking the Soviet threat more seriously, but he never admitted that Patton had been correct in recommending immediate military action. He insisted that such action would have been politically impossible and strategically risky. That was Eisenhower's limitation. Eisenhower was brilliant at managing coalitions, understanding politics, and making compromises, but he struggled to see beyond the short-term political consequences. He could not imagine acting decisively against a growing threat if it meant risking his reputation or political position. Patton, by contrast, was completely different. He did not care about politics, alliances, or public opinion. He did not worry about his post-war career or how people would view him. Patton only cared about destroying America's enemies while the opportunity existed. He looked at the world as a battlefield and believed in acting decisively when circumstances were in America's favor. In the end, Eisenhower and Patton represented two very different approaches to leadership. Eisenhower was the political genius, cautious and careful. Patton was the strategic warrior, bold and fearless. One prioritized reputation and alliances, the other prioritized opportunity and the hard realities of power.
General George S. Patton died on December 21, 1945, at the age of 60. He had been paralyzed after a car accident and spent his final days in a hospital bed. Following his wishes, he was buried at the American Cemetery in Luxembourg alongside the soldiers of the Third Army. Patton had always said he wanted to be buried with his men, and in death he remained true to that promise.
Even after his death, Patton became a symbol, but for different groups of people, he symbolized very different things. To conservatives, Patton represented the warrior who saw threats clearly and believed that strength and action were better than appeasement or compromise. They admired his courage and his willingness to speak the truth even when it was unpopular. To liberals, Patton represented the dangerous militarist who seemed to prefer war to diplomacy. They worried that his aggressive ideas could have led to unnecessary conflict and bloodshed. To the general public, he remained the brilliant and daring tank commander who had helped win World War II. His battlefield successes were remembered and celebrated long after the war ended. The question of whether Patton had been right about the Soviet Union was answered by history. Almost everything he predicted came true. The Soviets occupied Eastern Europe, communist governments expanded around the world, and the Cold War lasted for decades. Millions of people suffered and died under communist regimes. Whether Patton's proposed solution, using military force in 1945, would have worked is impossible to know for certain. Whether it should have been attempted is still debatable. But one fact is clear. He correctly identified the threat years before most American leaders were willing to admit it. Patton's tragedy was that he was right at the wrong time. He saw the danger in 1945, but other leaders would not acknowledge it until 1947 or later. He suggested action when it might have worked. Instead, he was silenced and removed from command. He died before he could ever say, "I told you so." The generation of American leaders who ignored Patton's warnings went on to fight the Cold War he had hoped to prevent. They spent 45 years and trillions of dollars containing Soviet power, fighting wars, building alliances, and living under the threat of nuclear conflict, when, in Patton's view, a decisive moment had already passed in 1945. Whether their choices were right is a question that each observer must answer for themselves. What is certain, however, is that their decisions had enormous consequences, politically, economically, and humanly. Patton's voice still echoes across the decades as a warning. Sometimes the prophet is dismissed. Sometimes the truth-teller is silenced. Sometimes the leader who sees clearly is removed by politicians who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The lessons of Patton's story are important even today. Strategic threats should be confronted while they are vulnerable, not managed until they become far more dangerous. Political constraints should inform military decisions, but they should not completely determine strategy. Generals who speak the truth even when it is unwelcome should be heard. These lessons were learned at enormous cost over the next 50 years, and perhaps they will need to be learned again in the future.